Christopher Stanley, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I'm really excited for our chat. Sports psychology is going to be our main topic of conversation, but within sports psychology, you've held many roles. The audience may not be familiar with who you are, what you do, so please give us that introduction before we begin.
Well, thanks for having me and inviting me. I appreciate it. I'm glad to chat in and around this topic and this field. So my full-time position is in academia. It's the University of Western States, which is the main campus is in Portland, Oregon. There is a graduate program in sport and performance psychology, and again, I'm full-time faculty within that program. I reside in Tallahassee, Florida, and so full time there. A Some of the relevant side gigs with varying levels of intensity, I guess, or breadth or depth. Uh, in previous years, this past quad bookended by the Tokyo and Paris Olympics with other events, including world championships in between. I was lead sports psychology for USA Track and Field, so the athletics to the rest of the world federation here in the US. So I have since transitioned off that lead role, but remained the psych services subcommittee chair for USATF with a bit more organizational administrative duties. And I'm also the lead mental performance consultant for the Atlanta Track Club, their elite program, which is in my region. It's much easier for me. It's relatively easy for me to get up there. And their elite program specializes in the mid-distance events. So they have a lot of 800-meter runners, 1,500-meter athletes within that program. And so part of that sport med team, we have weekly meetings there, a lot of check-ins with athletes. And beyond that, I have engaged in some scholarships, some writing, books broadly related to the field, whether the target audience was coaches or whether the target audience is youth and adolescent athletes and associated mental performance skills. And so that often also connects me to those individuals within those populations, again, coaches, youth athletes, who are, needing some type of consult. And at the tail end of all this, I'm also, speaking of youth athletes, I'm also an assistant track and field coach at the high school level out here. So two of my children are on that team. So it's possible that I get too much track and field, but that's just my life. And once you're in, it's hard to get out.
Yeah, I don't know if much of the audience here would agree there's such a thing as too much track and field, but no, I am conscious anytime I bring a sports psych on here that they have that kind of pardon me, have that kind of background, whether it's from your practice standpoint or they've served as a previous coach, because sometimes it's difficult to maybe highlight the value of sports psychology and how it connects to the performance side of things, the well-being side of things. But given your diversity in roles, there's certainly a lot of ability to probably communicate the value to various different populations, whether it's coaches, youth athletes, or people more on the performance side of things. I'm interested to probably jump on there and just talk a little bit about, how do you generally highlight the value of sports psychology? A lot of our listeners here today are coaches, so I think that would be a particular population that would be of interest. But in general, as far and as wide you want to go there.
Yeah. So I think there's varying levels of buy-in to mental skills within the coaching realm. I think maybe I have just been fortunate, but whether it's through USATF or fellow coaches at the high school level or elsewhere, conferences, other networks, for the most part, I have been exposed to openness to it and coaches that recognize the importance of mental skills. I think there may still be a divide there, and divide might be the wrong word. There still may be a knowledge gap with coaches knowing exactly best practices in terms of how to implement it. You know, I can't do it because we don't have the resources to consult with a sports psychology professional, and that's not necessarily that's not absolutely necessary. I'll probably make the case for that. There's other resources. Or coaches just not knowing how they themselves could connect with a resource that they could then embed in their training cycles. And as a coach, I fully understand there's only so many hours in a day. And if you're talking about student athletes that you're coaching also, like they're loaded with athletic and academic and other personal tasks. And the idea of it's hard enough to embed some of the other supplemental stuff like strength and conditioning or cool down, you know, stretching, some of those best practices. You're probably trying to talk to them about nutrition and best practices and hydration. So I understand that when you start talking about, wow, there's this other supplemental piece to athletics that I recognize is important, but there's just no time, you know. So, but I think my message, and this might just be an underlying beyond just like a philosophy with athletes or coaches, like I do like to circle back to simple ideas and concepts and how they could be integrated into um, kind of your pre-existing schedules and routines. And I think for me, that's how I would get buy-in is, okay, what are you doing now? What's your schedule like now? What's your training practice schedules like now? What do you perceive as your athletes' performance needs? Like, let's examine what could be done within your pre-existing training schedule, and what are also some resources that athletes could practice on their own in between practice or competition. And let's just, you know, let's start there. Let's start folding that in. But there is often, I think, uh, one of the paradoxes that is alive and well in athletics and often track and field is that less is more. And so, yeah, let's start basic, something that sounds manageable, something relevant, and let's explore that. But it usually doesn't take like a deep, invasive consult, long sessions. Like, here's some resources, think about that, fold it in with your athletes, and let's go from there.
Mm. So the biggest resistance sometimes can be the fact that people feel that they need to add more time, whereas you're actually saying there's lots of opportunities that exist within a daily basis of what you've already got going, and that's where we start to create, I suppose, a sense of management that this can fit into the
Yeah.
technical practices that you already have going and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a theme. I don't know if it's yeah, it's absolutely something I hear fairly frequently, but also again, as a coach, I can I mean, you think about it, I'm a high school coach, I have a background in sports psychology. I don't have time to fold in like mental skills, like workshops on a regular basis. So I think coaches knowing that they can be creative, work within the limitations or the boundaries that they have within practice, and go from there. I was talking to an athlete recently, not in a formal like client. She's a training partner with my son pole vault, and anyway, I'm out there enough because as a dad, I guess again, maybe erring on the side of maybe I'm experiencing too much track and field, but I love it, so I don't want that to come across the wrong way. But triangulating things with her and her coach, just what some of the performance needs are. You know, just being there at the side of the runway and being able to gather from that athlete what some simple techniques or skills maybe that they could employ before an approach, before a jump. Um, that's largely why I know you haven't, I mentioned it earlier, but that's largely why I wrote that book, is because I was getting continual um, um, requests for that kind of resource. So I was in a position I could say, like, you know, handed her a book and say, I want you to look at this. I want you to focus on these particular skills that you identified as most relevant. So they had something that they could practice. And it was related, in this case, it was related to breath work, and it was related to some concentration exercises, which would allow them to be a bit more focused and centered and calm, which is what they needed in kind of this kind of pre-jump routine, which at the risk of going off on a tangent, Coleman, I'll try not to, but I think a lot of the listeners and coaches in track and field can appreciate this is not a one size fits all sport. I mean, there's a lot of diversity and variation with athletes and needs. You have, well, one, you have track, you have distance, and you have sprints, you have field, and then even within the field, you have throws, right? You have jumps, and within a lot of the field events, you get multiple attempts that you have to navigate. And a lot of the track athletes are like, "What? Like more than once? Like, what? How do you manage that space in between?" And then you have the horizontal jumps like pole vault and high jump, and the way those sports, excuse me, the way those events play out, even on a PR day, your last attempt will be a failed attempt. And so, like, right, you go till you have three scratches, right? Your last attempt, even if it was a great day. So, how do those athletes manage spaces in between? How do those horizontal jump athletes manage mistakes? So it's, and again, I say failed attempt. I'm not implying they're a failure that day, but there's a big difference between those two. But yeah, but getting to know an athlete's specific needs and giving them the resources to practice those a bit. But then as a coach, I think you're in a space where you can just prompt that. I mean, think about what goes on in the course of a pole vaulter or an athlete doing jumps. There's approach in practice, approach on top of approach on top of approach. It's just like, let's stop any problematic cycle in practice that is just really disruptive and distracting. Like, let's also let them be practicing that stillness, that pre-jump routine in practice, and increase the likelihood they'll be able to implement it in competition scenarios. So I think I went off on a little bit of a tangent there, but it was just a brief example about, yeah, these can be implemented, like breath work and concentration exercises. That doesn't even have to be practiced only in sport context. Like, practice breath work at home, practice it in class. The same thing with concentration, like concentration grid or something that could be done in the mornings on a bus, like in class.
Mm. Yeah.
Assuming you're not, I'm not encouraging not paying attention to what the instructor's saying, but yeah, like this can be folded in. Mental skills can be folded in, and the practice can be folded in relevant ways for athletes without turning a practice routine on its side.
Mm. Yeah, what you're saying is the opportunities are pretty endless, and they're actually, if you look in front of you on a day-to-day perspective, they're there. Um, I firstly will say that I say this to all guests before they come on, is that the guest has full permission to ramble. So you do that as much as you want, because people are here to listen to you, not me. But something that you pointed out there with regards to the pole vault example, I really like that, because I don't think sometimes track coaches realize that let's say the simulation, or how the event runs is is similar to their own. Let's say you're a sprinter, like there, as you said, one trial and you're done, and there's not as much room for thought or need for maybe composure other than, pre block start or what have you. So, I suppose the entry point for sports psychology or mental skills, as you say, is different per event, and what sports psychology or mental skills looks like for a distance athlete might look different for a pole vaulter. I think that's really important to understand, because I think that might be allowing for that difference is what maybe allows or disrupts coaches' buy-in to the idea of it in the first place. Because if they're used to just coaching middle distance, then and they feel like effort is the main driving force in that, they don't see where the mental side kicks in. But the mental side might kick in when fatigue hits or
Yeah,
something like that.
absolutely.
The other thing I
And
was
you
going to
think
say,
about, oh, go ahead.
sorry, the other thing I was going to say after saying that I give you permission to rant, the other thing I was going to say was, do you find in those examples or context where athletes need composure and all that kind of stuff, that equally the coach's role is there to facilitate that, not just from a prescription of mental skills or allowing them to go through that, but actually that the coach's demeanor has an interaction effect with whether that's
Yeah.
going to take place or not. If you get what I'm saying, a coach has a role
Yeah.
almost to utilize psychological principles to
Yeah.
foster that environment, if I'm making
There's
sense.
there's no doubt. And Colm, yeah, there would be no shortage of examples I could give. Well, I wouldn't share the examples because of confidentiality, but absolutely that can be a facilitating factor, like something with it's an interaction effect. You have two individuals, and it's not just individual A and individual B. They come together, and a sum is more than the whole of its parts. There's a new dynamic, and I won't focus like say, oh, coaches, they just have that's true for anyone. There could be family in the stands, there could be training partners, there can be competitors, but the concept is coaches could have a facilitating role and something that helps athletes maintain some type of equilibrium or helps facilitate um, a state or a zone that is more conducive to performance. Coaches and others can also take athletes in different places as well. And so I think there's a couple layers that you could uh, consider a response to this. One is, yes, could they know they're in those spaces, right? At certain levels, coaches can't be right there, right in between throws at the Olympics. The coach is often the stands, but in between throws at the high school level, like, yeah, your coach could be in your face. So they could prompt, if you have been working on something, they could be gentle prompts or nudges or reminders in those situations. But coaches can also model behaviors and thoughts, frankly, that for coaches in those spaces. External thoughts, external words, I should say, and even behaviors have a way they can be internalized. And so you think about that. We've been focusing on field athletes a lot in that like between attempt space. But think about a coach in between those spaces that is clearly frustrated and behaviorally, body language clearly expressing that, verbally maybe saying or doing things in a tone or content that is not conducive to good mechanics, or again keeping an athlete regulated. Like, they'll internalize that, and even if you are working on something or the athlete is working on regulating themselves, I mean, another individual can directly impact how well they're able to do that. And I think in athletics, in open environments, there's enough distractions already. And I think, we never know what weather is going to be like. We're never going to know if it's going to be on schedule or not, like what competitors or spectators will do. Like, there's enough distractions anyway. And I like to uh, advocate for athletes being able to put themselves in the best position they can to succeed. And again, coaches can be very influential in that space, not only nudging and prompting, but kind of displaying, outwardly displaying, like a demeanor or approach that they think athletes will respond to. And again, not a one size fits all thing. Maybe some athletes, some sprinters need to get really amped up. And I'm not picking on sprinters. Maybe a 3K runner needs to get amped up, but I don't know. But maybe they really need to get amped up and they need someone kind of in their face, like getting them to that explosive space. But there's other athletes that do not need that at all. And so yes, to your point, coaches are very influential in that way. Behaviorally, I think outwardly, behaviorally, and what the athletes kind of keying in off them, but also in terms of being in that space and being able to give nudges or guidance. But it is, to circle back to a point I made earlier, it would be very individually, it's something you would consider individually. And that's where knowing your athletes and what their needs are, preferences, tendencies, characteristics are helpful.
Yeah, I would jump on that point. I had an interaction before with one of my former coaches, and he at a collegiate meet, we were competing at 10 a.m. and I generally, he didn't know this. I competed terribly in the morning, and I was having a pretty bad day. I was 5 jumps into a long jump competition, and he came over and said something to me that probably was a pretty risky at the time because he had never said it to me. But he was like, you gotta wake up or something. You gotta make something happen. You got 1 jump left, and he was like, get the clap or something. And like I never did that, but at that time, I listened to him and I was like, yeah, do you know what? I'm like in good shape, but I'm jumping terrible right now. And sure enough, I did that, and it just gave me that extra adrenaline um,
Okay.
that I needed, and I ended up having like a 30 centimeter improvement in that attempt. I tried to do that same thing on another day. Didn't work for me because I was already amped up. It was a championship and I actually didn't need
Ooh,
it. And that just, I think, serves as a useful example to your point there that there's an individual kind of piece to it, but then also the situational as well. And he probably was able to read that off my body language.
absolutely. So yeah, when you started sharing that story, I think it illustrates well a coach that knew their athlete relatively well. And in that moment, although it was risky, it was a strategic risk on their point, on their part, because they knew you. And if it was a risk, they felt it was somewhat informed and it worked. But the amplification effect was coming the next time around, was coming from the pressure or whatnot. But I think it illustrates well the concept of athletes have kind of individualized zones. I don't know why your example made me think too that yeah, there's just so much variation. Like that was a long jump competition with 5 attempts. At the high school level, you might have 3 attempts, but you know how high school meets go, depending upon officiating and how many people are there. There might be 15 minutes in between your throws or your attempts, and just all kinds of nonsense going on in between. It's very situational, but having kind of a toolbox where you have some regulatory strategies, maybe those that could amp you up, maybe those that could bring you down a bit. Not bring you down like in terms of like deep relaxation, but you're kind of moving a needle type thing. Some basic distractions. But that's the other thing that your example made me think of. He came up and said, "You got to wake up." I think in that space, you probably knew what that meant
Mhm.
physiologically or cognitively. But one of the reasons I wrote that book as well is just observation. You hear it all the time at all levels of sport, all levels of competition, and all sports. You hear coaches and even parents and teammates they say things to athletes in usually competition moments. You got to focus. You got to be aggressive. Just take a breath. See the pitch. You got to wake up. Whatever it might be. I think those are often thrown out there, and athletes don't really know what that means. It's like, take a breath. Oh, I am breathing. Like, what's your point? Like, wake up. I am awake. What's your point? Like, there's that. So, I mean, part of the book, not all of it, is just like, let's make these more like practical. Okay. Because otherwise they're just like, I don't know, they're words and they're just going to fall flat. And over time, I think it almost does a disservice to the athlete, because I think the words kind of lose meaning. Like, no, there is a practical impact or skill laden within that message, but it's just, let's not handle it just the superficial level. If you hear that prompt, let's be able to do something with it.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting you say that because actually, having had discussions with athletes and now I'm kind of coaching too, I often feel they will say things that show their frustration behind when someone maybe makes a comment about their effort, right? So you say like, just go for it. And the athlete will come back and something similar to what you said. It's like, what do you mean? Like, I'm already going for it. I'm trying, haven't I? And I think if you don't have an intentional meaning or there's not been an education piece to support the words or inform them what that actually means, um, they almost feel like it's an insult, that
Mm-hmm.
they might not be trying. Of course I'm trying.
Yeah. And think about where that can lead in the context of a practice or a competition. A coach or parent or family, I'm not letting them off the hook here either,
Of course.
um, or training partner, if they're expressing something that's coming across as frustration, and the athlete doesn't perform as, I guess I'll say, ideally that day, think about what that sequence of circumstances has put together in a package for where that day is going to go. It's like, oh, so and so doesn't believe I was giving an effort. And believe me, I can't let athletes off the hook either. I mean, sometimes there are varying levels of
Of
effort
course.
and interest.
Absolutely.
But I mean, think about where that dynamic and interaction is going for the rest of that day. It's a box of frustration. They think coaches or family are disappointed in them. Uh, they're frustrated. What happens often is there might be like, sometimes there's a more of an explosive, frustrated interaction after the competition, but more often than not, I seem to observe they just kind of withdraw and kind of avoid one another for a period of time. And what happens in that avoidance space, which is understandable, but what happens in that avoidance space, that perception that their coach or athlete, family, whoever else is disappointed in them, only grows. It only grows into a monster. They only have their own imagination to let it like live and whatnot. And so that's another space where, as a consultant, like, if I'm ever in an observational opportunity, but I do the same as a coach, I don't like, I know when athletes have a day they're frustrated in. I try not to let them be invisible as much as they may try to be avoiding me or family, whatever else. And I try to have a calmer conversation, just a reflective thing, like, what happened, um, let's what's next, kind of like, what happened, excuse me, what happened and what's next, a couple of those what questions. And
Mm.
just let them know, as they remove themselves kind of from the immediacy of the environment, things will settle down. But we're going to just go back to practice. But I try not to let people feel invisible, because I know that that growth can occur and it can turn into something that it doesn't need to be.
Mm, mm. And do you find, maybe we'll jump on like some of your roles within USATF, because I know many people will be very interested to hear about, your experience at the likes of the Olympics, the World Championships, and so on. Like, I suppose you're probably dealing with both athletes and coaches to some degree in those capacities. Like, what kind of situations would you find yourself in? Obviously, there's certain things you can't say, but just some themes that you generally can draw upon having been in those spaces, because I think those are particularly interesting because they're high pressure. Everyone is intending to try to do their best, but it gets messy, I guess.
Yeah, messy's I think a good word. There can also be, and track and field or athletics can be interesting at kind of the world international team level, because it's not necessarily an intact group before that. I mean, you're certainly, they know one another, but it hasn't come together as a team until you kind of get off the airport or arrive at a venue. Now, is that absolutely necessary in all ways in athletics or track and field? Maybe not, but certainly with like relays, that becomes important. There is certainly some cohesion and, if not social cohesion, some at least task cohesion that can be helpful there. But yeah, with coaches as well. Are there personal coaches coming with them to the games or the World Championships, or are they not? Is there more of a staff coach there, and do they have different techniques or ideas? Like, there's a dynamic there. So absolutely, there's consulting that occurs at the coaching level in those contexts, whether it's, again, staff coach, personal coach. We try to be athlete centered and what would be best for the athlete, but something along the lines of a new coach that an athlete's exposed to on a world championships, maybe senior, maybe even U20, and an athlete, a coach has a suggestion for that athlete to implement that may be new or seemingly new to, say, their not necessarily like routine, but something related to their technique, say a thrower and their spin or something along those lines. It's like, whoa, we're gonna something. Think about the athlete's perspective. Whoa, something new here now. I don't know about that. That's a space for that. Consult has come up before, but coaches also consult. Sometimes with how to manage, how, kind of related to some of the points you made earlier, simple things that they may be able to nudge an athlete with to try to regulate them in certain spaces. So that does come up, but certainly with athletes, I think where the bulk of the applied work occurs. There is, I think you mentioned the pressure earlier, but absolutely, you have some athletes that have experienced that world stage before, and they have that experience behind them, but that doesn't necessarily, circumstances are always changing. You could have been a first-time Olympian, came in, you experienced it, you handled yourself to a certain degree, but then the next time around, there's greater expectations on you, and that's elevating pressure in a different way. So, are you used to it, or have you had experience with it? Yes, but now there's more expectations on getting through the preliminary rounds and whatnot. So it's always different. And then you have the athletes that haven't been there before, and it's like, whoa, this is new. And so I guess my point being that when you're getting to that next pressure level, and this isn't just true for elites. I mean, I could talk about the pressure level for um, a freshman on a high school team, like
Right.
going from middle school to high school. It's like, whoa, this is new. But when you are making that, going to that next tier of perceived pressure, like the coping skills and strategies that you used before may not work as effectively in the same way. So that very broadly is where I may interface with athletes. Okay, what has worked before? Okay, which is very predictive of what can work again, but maybe we need to try it in a next intensity or modality. Um, Maybe we can introduce some new things, but that's also not a space. It's often not a space where you want to do things beyond like brief contact interventions. There's not long drawn out sessions. Just like with physical techniques and routines, probably not major new things you want to introduce. You want to lean into, again, what's worked before, some of their strengths, some of the supports they may have at the games, whether training partners or personal coaches or whoever else. Um, so I don't know if that's kind of coloring in any way some of the stuff that may come up. Again, broadly, helping athletes navigate the circumstances in terms of the perceived pressure, in terms of the environmental demands that they're facing. But at the same time, trying to understand there's a uniqueness there,
Mm.
and almost co-producing, and that's a good word. It's also a good word in like the neurodivergence space, but really also the youth and adolescent space, but co-producing ideas with them and
Mm.
techniques, letting there be some level of autonomy and personal relevance for what you're trying to work on with them.
Mm. Yeah, I love that actually. That's really great, and that probably circle back into your overarching philosophy, which we'll talk about in a second. But what I'm hearing there is really that you're trying to get a sense of the athlete's narrative about the situation. Would that be, you use the word perception. I think narrative kind of fits into that. Like, what do they think about this scenario? Coming back second time for the Olympics, they're ranked third in
Yeah.
the world. They were previously, quite lucky to get into a final. It was a bit of an overachievement. Now it's kind of like, as you say, expected. And these things are real. They have real, not consequences, I'll say, but they have real propensity
Yeah,
to get
absolutely.
involved in what will or will not happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, you think of a first time Olympian who qualified out of nationals at whatever country they're representing. And sometimes surprises happen there. It's like you go in ranked eighth or 10th and you get top three or two or whatever. Like, whoa, what? Oh, I made it. I'm going to, next thing you know, you're going through team processing, you're on the team. I think sometimes those athletes, once they get to the games, they're sensing pressure, certainly. But there's also sometimes those athletes, they're happy to be there. They're happy for that opportunity. They're still putting their best self forward and preparing in meaningful ways. But I often sense with those athletes, even if they don't get out of the prelims, they are very gracious and joyful and happy for what happened in the experience. But again, the next cycle, it's like, no, I know I can get there. Now I'm there. There's just, yeah, it's a different set of expectations that are bestowed upon themselves personally, like so inwardly, but then also outwardly. It's like you made the Olympic team, and moving forward, you are an Olympian. So
Hmm.
will people will let you know that.
Interestingly, I know we're talking a lot about the situational stuff here, but I think about like the build up to those championships. Like there's a lot of time that is separated between, let's say, trials and the actual championships. And I think one thing that
Mhm.
might help coaches to understand like just the capacity sports psychology has, and self-regulation in particular when you're talking about that, is the fact that, you know, perceived pressure, this narrative that we're talking about, has the capacity to have physiological effects on the athlete, which does interfere with the preparation somewhat. So for those who maybe are thinking like, I'm going to do 5K and there's not really as much inner dialogue going on as there is in the long jump, but in reality, there's a whole build up to the event as well. And without the mental skills to manage that process, then we actually have a potential cost there on the physiological side. I don't know if you agree with that. Does that make sense? That's my understanding
No,
of reading.
no, absolutely. Like, and sometimes that's why, well, I'll circle back, but that's why for me, breath work is such a solid anchor of a behavioral skill and tool to have, because it harnesses a variety of physiological and mental processes. And again, we're often not going for deep relaxation, which breath work can be used for that. I mean, it works well when you, it works well to get you in a deep relaxed state. But even in terms of just, I talked about moving that needle, even in terms of bringing like a respiration rate, heart rate down slightly. Um, that is, breath work is that harness for some of those physiological, those typical observable physiological processes. But with breath work also, if you're employing certain cues, which if done correctly often are, if you have like a count or a rhythm, if you're doing like square breathing, like count of four, hold it, count of four, inhale, count of four. If you're doing like square breathing or whatever else, if there's some rhythm, or if there's some physical cue to your breath work, like diaphragmatic breathing, like, you're looking for the, um, I guess, the movement of your belly, or maybe you're doing kind of a wave breath where it's moving through your upper and lower midsection, abdomen. Like, you're giving your mind also simple cues that can occupy space, mental space that is otherwise available for other things. And sometimes those other things are distracting and irrelevant. In fact, many times they're distracting and irrelevant. So one of the reasons breath work is such an excellent anchor is for those reasons. It harnesses a lot of different processes. Um, but yes, so you're right. There is a lot of time between, like, let's say, a championship event and like world championships, several weeks often. This might have some application for high school coaches as well. They know conference championships or districts or whatever else, state for some athletes is coming up in a few weeks. That might be an appropriate time in practice scenarios to introduce, if you haven't yet, to be kind of making introduction of mental skills. And actually, Colm, that's often time for me when that dialogue begins. Like an athlete coming through processing, they're coming across the med table, introducing myself. Yes, I'll be on the ground at these world championships, these Olympic games. If you want to touch base leading up to that, here's my contact info. Let me know. Yeah, a lot of them follow. That's the first point of contact. If I don't know them already, it's like, yeah, let's talk about this. And so we do some forward thinking planning to get them ready. And coaches, yeah, absolutely would be in a space with their athlete that they could forward, like, have you been to this kind of level of competition before? This is how it's going to be different. And, this is how maybe we can prepare for it. Maybe breath work, maybe other regulatory skills, strategies, maybe some, concentration exercises can be folded in. Sometimes with athletes, they get to a point where they want to unplug from social media a bit, because, high school example would be one thing, but when an athlete makes the Olympics, during those weeks, things can really blow up. The attention they get from social media, there's interviews, there's a lot of stuff going on in that buildup. And sometimes it makes sense to do a strategic, respectful unplugging. more easily said than done sometimes. Some athletes have a lot of followers and there's some sponsors, whatnot involved there. So sometimes there's some strategy involved there. High schoolers probably wouldn't want to do it for other reasons, but yeah, sometimes we just need to unplug, keep things simple, keep things focused. Um, Again, all in an attempt or aim to be as well positioned at that event, be as well prepared as possible. And that's often what athletes at the highest level want, to be able to step up to that line or that ring or that runway, that approach, and just be able to say, I have done everything within reason to prepare myself best for this moment. And when you can't say that, that's sometimes where frustration and regret can kind of breed. But at the elite level, athletes are doing what they have to do to be able to step up, to be able to say that. And mental skills, routines, prep is part of that.
Hmm. Do you prescribe oftentimes, or is this in your kind of general like toolkit, if I want to say, like self-talk and imagery, is that part of it too? Do you find that something to be frequently used?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And even in some of the examples, I would say those are some of the common mental skills. They're certainly within the what I do in applied spaces, but also kind of contents of the book I wrote. So absolutely, um, self-talk is self-talk is one of those exercises that it's helpful to have some structure to. Um, so it's about recognizing the illogical, the self-defeating stuff. It's about putting yourself in a position where you can um, offer rebuttals to that, and then have some type of redirect, simple redirect. So you want to take yourself from distracting, irrelevant, self-defeating, whatever it may be, um, kind of try to push back on a little bit, but then have a quick, simple redirect, whether to a relevant cue or affirmative type statement. You do get better with practice with this, but it's often, to my point, more structured. It's often time well spent. And maybe to complement this with some journaling exercises to do some of the identification and rebuttal and redirect. One way I simplify, excuse me, this down sometimes is for an athlete delineating between fact and feeling. And oftentimes we fight feelings with facts. And even at the elite level, you find your athletes expressing things sometimes like uncertain if they like belong there, if things are going to go right. And certainly down at other levels, collegiate, high school, like, am I ready? I don't think I can do it. Like, well, okay, those are feelings. Those are kind of self-defeating feelings. I know they're thoughts, but they're producing other nervousness and doubt and what. Um, what are the facts, right? Facts are you qualified. Like, I like the objective facts. The facts are you have done this before. You have this objective, quantifiable time or distance or past experiences or accomplishments. Like, those are the feelings. Let's be certain to like take time to unpack the facts, and let's drown that out a little bit. What you have to be cautious with, Colm, this does take, sometimes it's time well spent to unpack that with the athlete, but they don't necessarily want to revisit all of that unpacking in some of those performance moments. You just want to be able to push back and go to the redirect quickly, because there is, I've spoken about paradoxes today. Another paradox that's alive and well is the ironic effect. The more you try not to think about something, invariably the more you will think about it. And maybe this is another one of those just generic surface levels surface level things athletes hear sometimes, like, you got to believe in yourself, or you got to think positively, or you got to forget the last play or attempt or whatever that. Well, that is true, but have they ever engaged in some type of cognitive restructuring that will help them do that? And so, again, on one hand, it's helpful to have some structure to that, but you do want to get the athlete to a point in competition where they can more simply just redirect, and maybe they can let some of their breath work or other technical cues kind of pick up from there. If that kind of makes
Yeah.
sense. Absolutely, self-talk is absolutely part of it. Um, so it's a delicate balance. You want to work on it and recognize it and give them tools, but at the same time, what you really want them to be able to implement is more of a quick redirect when it
Hmm.
boils down to it.
Hmm.
And you don't want them revisiting all the what ifs and and the laundry lists of facts or rebuttals or whatnot. It's not time and space for that. We want to just say we've done it and now we can get back to that redirect.
One thing that I noticed is A, really well researched in sports psychology, and maybe it's because I haven't delved into coaching research as much, but B, like something I think is really important within I suppose the scheduling of consultancy work in sports psychology is the importance of building rapport. And I think regardless if you're a coach or a sports psychologist, like knowing what that looks like, whether you get a new athlete or you're actually just trying to improve the relationship you already have with your athletes, that's really important because all the fancy stuff really doesn't take shape unless that's solid. And I suppose I'm
Mhm.
interested to get your thoughts and like what your kind of philosophy is on that.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. There's and that has a lot to do with motivational states and climates that exist on a team or in a training group. That like sense of connectedness. You're not just being shown up. You're not just showing up to be told what to do. There's some emotional connection. I'm not suggesting coaches need to turn their self on their side and be like anything that they're not. Um, some coaches have more of an authoritarian style, but I would encourage them. Excuse me, some have more of a. I confused. There's authoritarian and there's authoritative. Some coaches have more of the authoritative, I think it is, where it's like my way or the highway type. You show up, I'm going to tell you what to do it, and there's no warmth or emotional connection there. I would encourage coaches to think you can still have the root authority piece there, but authoritarian incorporates some degree of connection and nurturance and warmth there. And that, whether you're talking about coaching, whether you're talking about parenting, actually, that tends to yield the best outcomes. And so athletes need rules and structure, absolutely. Training plans do, but they also need to know you care for them personally at some level. Again, I'm not suggesting you turn your style, but I mean, is there room for you to is there room for a coach to put um, on their wall in their office like a list of their athletes and just keep a note or mental note of when they check in with them on other things they have ongoing? Um, do you do that? Do weeks or months or seasons go on where you don't really kind of drop down to that more personal level? You don't have to get deeply personal to just touch base with how things are going in school or at home or in other professional capacities. Nothing wrong with that at all. Are there ever spaces where you, as a coach, let the athlete have a voice? I talked about co-production. no coach, including myself, is going to let an athlete or athletes make call all the shots on what they do. But is there certain practices, spaces where they can have a bit of a voice and guide where they go or what they want to do on that such and such a day? That fosters a sense of autonomy, but it also kind of conveys a level of respect, I think, and that kind of folds in to the rapport piece, but it also folds into the motivational climate piece. You're connecting with them, you're giving a sense of autonomy. Connectedness and autonomy are two of the three pillars when it comes to the you've probably covered this in some of your sports psych
Self-determination theory, isn't it?
self-determination theory. Absolutely. So just so you know, thank you, Colm. I'm not shooting from the hip with that. But yeah, connectedness and autonomy, and it's even those two things I mentioned could come out in a lot of different ways. But are you making room for that in the course of your day, in your week? Do you find yourself just focusing more on the athletes that are performing, that are scoring points for you at conference meets, that are qualifying beyond, or are there other developmental athletes in your team, in your space, that maybe some of these ideas would help prompt you to maintain connection there? And it all feeds into motivation, but it folds into kind of the climate and the rapport you build as well.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of coaches listening to this will want is they want more motivated athletes, athletes that are self-motivated that don't
Mhm.
necessarily need to be instructed, but it's really um, interesting how you showed that autonomy, that level of freedom to some degree, co-creation, as you named it, like has a role to play in actually fostering that. And I think it's a really interesting model to take a lot of to think about, and it's very digestible too, which I find I think was one of the first ones I came across, and when I was doing my graduate studies, that just kind of made me interested in sports psych really, and understand it a little bit more. But the
It's certainly a theory that I would feel that I lean into, and there's a lot. There's self-determination theory, there's self-efficacy theory, there's a lot, but it's the motivational theory I feel comfortable coming on a podcast and putting out into the universe. It's a good one.
Yeah, I think coaches will resonate with a lot. The last thing I wanted to discuss, I could obviously chat to you all day, but you've got a demanding schedule. So I do want you to take the time to talk about your book because I know you've referenced it a little bit in these conversations, and I think ultimately some great walkaway tools for coaches listening to this is those resources that you've mentioned, and you've got your own. So feel free to share a little bit about what those are and how we can find them.
Well, I appreciate that, Colm. Appreciate that. I have a copy down there, but it doesn't always show up on Zoom well. But the book is called Right from the Start: Mental Performance Skills for Youth and Adolescent Athletes. And it really, when I talk about youth, it is kind of older children as they're kind of approaching adolescence. But the point is, it's not completely irrelevant for children or athletes or performers younger than that. But I do kind of think of that age, that cognitive age of development where they understand where to apply certain things. So anyway, in this book, which is written for them, I needed help from editors and Grammarly in writing in a tone appropriate for an adolescent, because I'm used to more of a scholarly tone, which would not be appropriate for this book. But it is written for them, meaning that coaches and families can certainly read it, but I wanted it to be something that you could hand to an athlete and say, we've talked about this, we think it's relevant. Look at units A and B, or pages 17 and pages 39. Think about these skills and how they're relevant for performance. Let's practice and let's come back and talk about how we can fold this into a routine for you. But I cover throughout the book, after like some introductory pieces and making the case that mental skill work as an athlete or performer is not an indication of like a weakness. It's part of being a well-rounded athlete. So that's kind of a summary of what like an introduction would be. But I cover foundational skills, and then into mental performance skills. And there's an array of those. In fact, this might be a spot where I could at least read from it. So that's what it looks like. But I cover foundational skills when I talk about recharging, goal setting, time management, motivation, and confidence. The idea with foundational skills is these are kind of underlying concepts, but still modifiable skills or life areas that are worth examination, because when they're not in place to a certain space, it gets increasingly difficult to work on the mental performance skills. As a brief example, if there's an athlete not sleeping or getting any type of physical or mental rest, practice and performance will suffer. I say that very confidently. Same thing, I talk about like motivation or confidence. If those are very low, like it may be time well spent to go examine those and kind of get those built up to a certain degree before moving on to other more specific performance skills. When I talk about breath work, mindfulness, self-talk, attention, imagery, other environmental factors. And then what I do after their comb is I take those skills that I've talked about and I apply them in units of like pre-competition, competition, post-competition, and like out of competition. So like off season or injury or something along those lines. So I try to introduce the reader to those things, but also then give them examples of how they could fold into like a pre-performance routine or in a mini routine in between throws or jumps. Or like in competition, how these could work to regulate performance. And then afterwards, like in terms of pivoting to like a reflecting learning framework, like where do you go out? So anyway, introduce the skills, how to apply them in relevant ways. And so I appreciate the time to kind of introduce that a little bit. It's called Right from the Right from the Start. There are other books entitled Right from the Start, but mine is related to mental skills for youth and adolescent athletes. It is not the it's not the premarital couples counseling book that you may also encounter, but it's on Amazon and elsewhere where books can be found. And yeah, I love feedback on it. So yeah, whether it's like in the form of a review on Amazon or whatnot, I love feedback. So now I can know what to get right if there's another edition.
Fantastic, Chris. Yeah, no, I really think some coaches out there will find that valuable because we have a wide array of people listening to this from high school right up to collegiate. Would you say it's fit for collegiate level athletes as well?
Yes, yeah, it is absolutely, because again, even with collegiate or elite athletes that I work with, I always try to circle back and keep things simple. And I wanted to, on the surface, target youth and adolescent athletes, but it is absolutely digestible and I guess applicable is the word I'm looking for collegiates and beyond. So absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, that will cast a very wide net there. Chris, I do appreciate you coming on today. It's been fantastic chatting to you. Um, I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
I did. I had a lot of fun. I could talk about this stuff all day. So if you ever want to, do like a follow up and hone in on, stuff more specifically, happy to do so.
Thank you. I know you are probably about to talk about this stuff all day, so I will leave you go with that. Thank you for coming on again.
You're quite welcome. Take care, all.
Perfect.